Leckie and gender. Who is Leckie, I hear you say? Well, she's a science fiction author who won the Hugo, Nebula and other sci-fi awards for her book Ancillary Justice, published in 2013. This was the first in a trilogy, the others being Ancillary Sword in 2014 and Ancillary Mercy in 2015. The last of these also won the Hugo Award. This is a brilliant, and particularly in the last volume, sometimes hilarious sci-fi series that I would highly recommend. I'll just provide a brief description here of the world that Leckie created for these stories. The books are set thousands of years in the future, where the principal power in human space is an expansionist empire known as Radch, R-A-D-C-H. The empire uses spaceships which are controlled by AIs who control multiple human bodies. These are called ancillaries, to use as soldiers. The Radch don't distinguish people by gender, which Leckie conveys by using she pronouns for everybody. The main character, Breck, who is one of these ancillaries, often has to guess, and frequently incorrectly, which sometimes leads to humorous situations, what gender a person is when she has to use languages with gender-specific pronouns, which some of the cultures with which she interacts do. One of the reasons for this is because cultures vary enormously in terms of the dress styles and customs which they use to differentiate between the genders. There are no fixed cross-cultural characteristics that Breck can use by which to reliably differentiate between males and females. The reader doesn't know the gender, in our terms, of this central character, Breck, and often doesn't know either the gender of the people that Breck is interacting with, because Breck doesn't know. When she has sexual relations with one or other of these characters, we have no way of knowing what kind of sexual relationship this is. None of this is important to Breck. I love these books, quite apart from this gender issue, but the way Leckie deals with gender in these books is brilliant. At first, when reading the books, it all seems a bit confusing. Initially, it's easy for the reader to assume that Breck is female, and because everyone else is referred to as she, it's easy to assume, initially at least, that everyone else that she encounters is female too. When it becomes apparent that a character is actually male, in terms of our conventional understanding of that, this can be quite a jolt, and it can require a kind of retroactive rewrite in our minds of all the previous encounters we've had with that character and the events with which they've been involved. After a while, though, the reader, at least this reader, along with Breck, begins not to care about gender at all. I found myself, after a while, no longer even asking the question, particularly when Breck was interacting with other people from within this Radch culture. It simply didn't matter. I found it quite amazing, in fact, how quickly these gender identities became completely irrelevant to me as the reader. Whether a particular character was male or female in our terminology was of no importance whatsoever. Whether a sexual encounter was between two people of the same sex or different sexes was completely irrelevant. I couldn't believe how easy it was for me to make that transition, at least while I was living in that world. I didn't make the transition completely, of course, not all of the time, but most of the time. It would still occasionally come as a surprise to me when a character I had assumed unconsciously was one sex turned out to be the opposite. But the surprise was also, surprisingly, quite pleasing. All of the assumptions I'd been making, probably based on that character's behaviour or role in society, were suddenly undermined, which I found quite delightful. Some might ask, why did Leckie decide to use she and related pronouns as the universal pronouns for Radch culture, rather than, say, they, them, or some invented neutral pronoun, or even maybe it? Well, I think this was consciously subversive, although you'd have to ask her whether that's actually the case. I say this because of something that continues to happen in society today, largely without our even realising it. In our trivia competitions, there's something called the puzzler. After each of 6 rounds, we're given a clue to this puzzler, which may be a place, a person, a thing, and so on. It's amazing when it's a person how easy it is to slip into using the pronoun he, although actually we have no idea of that person's gender. And I know I'm guilty of this myself. As a man, my first thought is he. I don't know if women also do this, or do they first assume she? I suspect, though, that many women would also first assume he. If you don't do that, great. It's one of my aspirations to stop doing that, but it is a deeply ingrained response. What Leckie did for me in these books was to flip that on its head by using she as the universal pronoun. For a long time, he and other masculine terms have been used universally and indiscriminately to mean a person. We may be having a conversation, for example, about how doctors should behave, and we might say something like, when a doctor graduates from medical school, he faces, or she, someone might jump in. How many times have you heard that? Or she? Because when the gender of the person is unspecified, we've been inclined to use he as the default pronoun. I try to use they these days as a singular gender-neutral pronoun, although often I'll forget. What Leckie does is flip this on its head and use she as the default pronoun. This is more striking and effective than using something that we consider gender neutral would have been, because of course he is not gender neutral in our culture. It carries with it all kinds of gender implications. By using she, Leckie makes us aware of the gender implications of that word too in our culture, and this gives her the tools and the power to expose and undermine our assumptions. Gender is a social construct. Sex refers to certain biological, physiological traits, which can actually vary quite a lot. It's far from the simplistic male-female dichotomy that some would like to claim. Gender, though, is a cultural and social construct. What one culture or society defines as feminine characteristics, behaviour, and roles may be entirely different from those defined by another culture. These cultural aspects vary enormously across time and space, and they can even be quite fluid within a particular society and even for an individual. One of our current mistakes is to identify certain biological characteristics associated with sex too closely with gender and gender roles. Leckie's trilogy undermines all of that. Breck has no way of knowing when she moves between cultures what particular roles, styles, behaviours, etc. are going to be identified as male or female in that particular culture. Are the men or women going to have long hair? Are the men or the women the ones who are wearing dresses? Are the men or the women, or both, those who will be wearing makeup or having certain bodily piercings? Are men or women in leadership roles? Are men or women the primary caregivers at home? All of these things are completely unrelated to biology. Breck knows that some societies use binary pronouns to describe people with different sexual characteristics. But for her, there's no link between these and the roles that people play in society. She can't tell from these roles and these customs which people she should be referring to as he or she. Because while the biological sexual differences might be the same, they're not at all related to the gender of the person, gender in the cultural sense. People in the Radch culture are not defined in terms of the sexual organs they happen to have. These do not determine their roles, their style of dress, or even their sexual proclivities. I was really surprised and also quite pleased by how easy it was to adjust to this worldview as I was reading these books. It was surprising how quickly assigning a sexually determined gender to a character became completely unimportant.